Jackal was running so fast he couldn't keep up with what was happening. He tripped on a log and was on the ground before he even felt his foot get caught on the wood. He was scratched on the face by some thorns and didn't even feel a sting until he was a few 50 paces away. His mind was racing and his heart was hammering. He was pushing branches and small trees out of the way, stumbling and dodging. His joints ached and his lungs were burning. And finally they broke through a clearing. They must have been running a lot harder than he thought. They were in front of the ruins. The forest seemed to be screaming out in a silent beg of mercy. The trees looked as if they were bending away from the ruins in a desperate crawl like an injured animal trying to escape a predator. There was no sign of any life. Not a chirp of a cricket, nor the howl of a wolf. Just the whistling breeze through the forest, which was equally haunting. The ruins themselves looked different, and as he walked around the walls, he knew why. The plants that had been growing on them had died and wilted off. They heard a rustle in some nearby bushes. This time Jackal was the first to move, practically throwing Kiara and himself behind a log. They didn't have any weapons of any kind, and he didn't feel like facing any of those things unarmed. The bushes rustled again. This time a figure emerged and made its way for the temple. The man looked to be about 6 feet tall. He was wearing what looked like black leather armor, and all he had for a weapon was a small knife strapped to his waist. He had a hood up over his head, but Jackal could make out 2 horns that protruded from inside the hood. Jackal had no idea what the man could have been, if a man at all. Following the figure were 2 of the creatures from the town. The 2 creatures then merged into one before the one collapsed in on itself and disappeared into a wisp of smoke that floated into the figure's hood. The man walked up to the abandoned temple. Jackal saw the man raise his arm, and he heard a snap. The wall exploded inward with a deafening blast. The figure entered through the wall. His entrance was then followed by screams. There was a twig snap directly behind them, followed by an inhuman rattling intake of breath. 2 bark tentacles shot from the bushes behind them and wrapped around the creature dragged her away towards the temple. Kiara was trying to scream and fight back, but was being choked and restrained. Jackal grabbed his sister's arm, but it wasn't enough. She was torn from his grasp and dragged into the building. Jackal grabbed a nearby stick and snapped it, creating a dull-pointed spear, a weapon he deemed good enough to pierce the creature's hide. He leapt over the log and sprinted for the entrance. Before entering, he froze. Dwarves, probably 10, where some were torn in half, others had holes in their chests. All were still bleeding onto the floor. Others' heads were imploded or exploded, and the hall was painted in a fresh, dripping red color. There was an iron, coppery smell of blood in the air. In the pool of blood, Jackal saw a smeared streak on the floor where something had been dragged. With his makeshift spear in hand, he followed the trail of parted blood that led to a room at the end of the hall. He approached the door with extreme caution. He felt a sense of dread fall into his chest. He put his hand on the door and slowly entered the room. It was unusually dark. There were dwarves in there too, but some of them looked as if half of their bodies had been consumed. The light from the torches in the hallway cast a beam of light onto the floor in the room, and it was casting a spear of light on Kiara, lying in the middle of the floor in a pool of blood. Jackal rushed to her side. He rolled her over onto her back. Her eyes fluttered open and she inhaled weakly, as if it pained her to breathe. She coughed up blood, adding to the puddle on the floor. It was then Jackal realized his sister's rib cage was misshapen. The bottom half was crushed inwards and the left side had 3 ribs sticking out in various angles. She wheezed again and tried to sit up.
Don't strain yourself.
Jackal tried to comfort her and keep her calm, which he felt wasn't doing much. He was beyond worried now.
You're safe.
That was questionable.
Jackal.
She gurgled through blood, seeping into her mouth.
Behind you.
Before he could react, Jackal was grabbed from behind, hoisted into the air, and thrown across the room. He landed on the floor and heard his head crack against the stone. As he tried to shake the daze away, he heard a raspy voice say,
"Humans are the strangest species to me. You try to save your kind by any means possible, even when you know it might as well be impossible."
Jackal scanned from the floor up. He could roughly make out a man in a black crystal mask, in the shape of a skull with 2 horns curling up. He was wrapped in a pitch-black cloak that seemed to be writhing in waves and ripples in what Jackal could only assume was a breeze. The man spoke again.
"You have a strong need to preserve your species, yet you seem to care for you and your needs only. You also want to try and control everything when it's just plain impossible. Very confusing."
Jackal didn't know why, but he was terrified. There was nothing unusually threatening about the man standing before him, yet he was just unsettling.
"I can tell what you're thinking. You're a confusing species to understand, but you're unbelievably easy to read. A sense of dread is replacing that unsettling feeling now."
Jackal felt every fiber in his body tense as he actually did start to feel dread. The person giggled. It wasn't human. It was a high-pitched rumble that didn't seem muffled at all by the mask he was wearing, and it sounded like it came more from the hollow of the man's throat. It echoed not only in the room, but through Jackal and his mind as well, weaving through the fibers of his muscles and the creases of his brain. He couldn't see the stranger's mouth, but he had a feeling that it was curved into a cruel grin.
"Well, I think that's enough fun messing with your mental state."
The stranger swooped in on him. The cloak spread out and took the shape of bat wings, propelling him forward at a blinding speed. His hand closed around Jackal's throat. Jackal was hoisted up in the air when a sword speared through the air and struck the man through the chest. The stranger dropped Jackal to the ground. He hadn't screamed in pain or flinched, and just slowly looked down at the blade sticking out of his chest. The sword was then twisted in its place by Jackal's father. He seemed calm. Calmer than he was in the town, yet there was a gleam in his eye that said he was scared. But his calmness turned to uncontrollable fear as the stranger started to what looked like fade in and out of existence. The blood that had spewed on the floor moved and rejoined with his body, which was turning into multiple tiny little pieces that looked like sand, and he turned into and reassembled himself, facing the other way, towards Jackal's father. He took hold of the sword's hilt, still sticking out of his chest, tore it out and buried it in Jackal's father's skull. His father's face snapped to pure shock and terror. Then the sword turned into a black smoke, which wove in and out of his father's body, unwinding it like a loose string in a shirt that restitched itself into the stranger's cloak.
"That was really annoying,"
said the stranger, turning towards him.
"Is that what pain feels like? Well, whatever. I've wasted enough time here."
The cloak billowed out as if a strong wind had blown from directly beneath him. It lifted the stranger, who grabbed Jackal by the throat and was once more dragged up the wall towards the ceiling.
I've got a soul to rebuild and a world to burn. Don't worry, I'll make this quick.
The stranger started to squeeze. The pressure was getting unbearable. His nails dug into Jackal's skin. He felt the fingers click into the inside of his jaw. His jugular was getting constricted so much he felt the blood get stuck and not complete its journey. He saw dark clouds enter from the sides of his vision. He wished for the discomfort to end. And then the birthmark on his shoulder started to burn. Not a soft burn like a few days ago, but a serious one, like a hot iron pressing out of his back. Then the stranger screamed out in pain. He dropped Jackal and they both fell to the ground. The stranger was screaming and staring at his hands, which were smoking as if they had caught fire. He wrapped his cloak around them and stood up, staggering towards Jackal, who was just as surprised at what had happened as the stranger was. But the stranger had gotten over it faster. Regretfully. He quickly and carefully grabbed Jackal's collar, making sure not to touch his skin, and threw him up onto the wall. The stranger looked furious and growled in his ear.
How did you do that?
Jackal was confused.
What are you talking about?
His skull was slammed against the wall again with a sickening crack.
Don't play dumb with me.
The grip was getting tighter. The pressure of his collar on the back of his neck seemed to cut into him.
I don't know what you mean.
Whatever. It doesn't matter. You can't do much anyway. When I kill you, do me a favor and just stay dead.
He smashed Jackal's head against the wall multiple times with multiple sickening cracks, and he slumped to the ground. He saw the stranger stagger towards his sister, and then the world went black.